13. Under the Gibbon Moon. You may be wondering about the picnic basket. Though North Dakota, with its wide views and its variegated grasslands, is a fine place to picnic, for most this holds only in summer. As Swede would later report in her short, scattershot, and extremely readable history, The Dakota Territory as I Recall It, few westward travelers since the emergence of internal combustion have attempted picnics in the Badlands in January. Anyone who's been there understands why. But Roxana Cauley was exempt from assumption. She knew, and her neighbors knew, that when the land lies buried in the miseries of winter, and loose boards twist with the cold, and the air hangs glassy and absolute over the world, that is when the merriest of all picnics happen. Anyone can tell you these are the times you need a picnic most, and the fact is, if you were lucky enough to live in North Dakota Badlands in 1963, you could load up and have one at will. We didn't know where she was taking us. Dad, driving, just followed her directions. We were a quiet troop. Swede was curled away from me, and I couldn't have spoken if I asked, for my throat ached with coming departure and with the beauty I had perceived in Roxana. So upright and calm she appeared, there in the front seat, and so graceful and so separate from Dad. Had the scene been mine to write, she'd have scooted closer to him. She'd have reached for his hand. Were Dad's heart my tablet, I'd have taken it up and erased Davy's name, so terribly did I wish to stay, and it had been whispered to me that all roofing had burned, to the last toothpick, so that we had no home to return to. I'd have rolled down the window and shouted thanks to heaven without a thought for Dr. Noakes or Bethany Orchard or anybody. We went round a bend and Roxana suggested we park, a difficult trick because the road was so skinny. Dad eased to the right till doors and hubcaps scraped the hard snow wall left by the plow. We piled out left. The road was a trench with sides too high to see over. We had to climb onto the plimth, bumper, hood, roof, which was something to laugh about and made us all more comfortable. But it was cold up on the snow. The moon was what Swede called a Gibbon moon, meaning not quite full but oval like a monkey's head, and it showed us a white hillside up which Roxana led us, her wool dress whipping. I ran and took the basket from her, and she put her mittened hand on my shoulder, and so we climbed, topping the hill at last to look down at what seemed a garden of fire. Fire and rising steam and specks of light, the specks pooling and running, then blinking out to be replaced by others. The fire came from a split in the earth that had opened and zigzagged away from the hills. Smoke and heat and sporadic low flames issued from this crack and from others branching outward. It was a fearful sight for young readers of Scripture, and Swede clutched my arm even as I looked at Roxana for reassurance. No, I didn't think it was the genuine hell. It was way too pretty. Yet Swede had read to me how the distinguished atheist Voltaire sat straight up on his deathbed moments before acquiring the farm, and with horror in his eyes described in journalistic particulars a geography of fire-spouts and molten earth and dense smoke that moved in heaps along the ground. All in all, an account not far from the sight before us now. No doubt Voltaire had a moment or two of deep regret before departing into that country. I know I was nervous, but down we went, descending the hillside lit by orange snow, down into the lee of the hill where the wind couldn't reach, and the snow as we walked got softer and wetter, and now we could see that the specks of moving light were streams of snowmelt, and the streams pooling and grating down into the crack were what created the steam and made the air so warm and sociable the lower down we went. Roxana told us how generations ago lightning had sliced into an aged cottonwood whose roots ran across a vein of lignite. The vein was narrow and deep, and the fire settled into the coal and spread inchwise until here, 100 years later, it lay before us, a snaky glowing web reaching away into the evening. It was only our good fortune, Roxana said, pulling her hood back from her face, that it had happened here, not in a more populous country, for then it would be a famous attraction like Hot Springs or Lourdes, where the multitudes of rich and feeble sat around in scalding mud with cotton up their noses. As it was, we were the only folks about, and though it might be 0 and blowing a gale up on the hill, down here, where the ground itself seemed coming unstitched, we had to undo our coat buttons and loosen our scarves. "Mr. Land, right here," Roxana said, and Dad took a folded blanket off his shoulder and flung it across a flat rock by the flames. The rock was bare and dry, and for radiant warmth it was like sitting on a rooftop. Before us, the crack was more than a yard across, and the fire pranced up out of it a foot high. Did you ever burn coal? It makes a white gold flame with a clean cerulean core. We leaned back on the blanket and were too warm, to our joy and disbelief, even unbuttoned. "Roxana," Dad said, "it's a miraculous place. I never saw better." He was sitting beside her. The firelight had restored his face to healthy color, and she, all French-braided, scarf unslung, resembled an opportunity missed by Rembrandt. I looked at Swede and saw hope showing in her face, and felt it in my own. "Come on, Reuben," she said, "let's explore." So off we went with not so much as a caution from Dad, for he was looking at Roxana through what I fancied were new eyes, she having worked a fairy tale in bringing us to such a place. It was indeed miraculous. How else to describe a valley where in deepest winter steam plumes as if from a battlefield, where boulders crouch warm as artillery, where spreading fire wakes frozen salamanders with which to scare your sister? We ran all over that piece of ground. We forgot the picnic. We jumped over narrow places in the crack and dumped armloads of snow down it for the thrill of the hiss. Once, resting against a heated stone, we witnessed the ignition of a dead juniper, a lacy brown juniper not 10 yards away. It gasped, incandesced, roared into flame, and departed forever. For a moment, Swede and I had the same thought, that things in this realm were subject to spontaneous combustion. Try that for an idea to give you the crawling heebies. But running over, she peered down the hole where the tree had rooted itself. Below lay the vein of glowing lignite. The event we'd seen must have happened here 1,000 times before. Returning, we saw a covered pan jetting steam beside the fire, also a small Dutch oven set a bit farther back. Dad and Roxana were talking lightly in the way adults do, who've just shifted gears to accommodate children, an infuriating tone for kids attempting to sound the future. Though Swede pried skillfully, Roxana was more than a match for her sidelong queries. We had to be content with the hearty smells from the pots and with noticing how Roxana sat, her back against a boulder, cushioned by Dad's folded coat. Were there time for it, I'd here describe the delicacies we later spooned up, the heavily salted beef stew with pearl onions, and, from the Dutch oven, a golden gingerbread sweetened with canned fruit, a caramely mixture Roxana called brown bear in a cherry orchard. But time was short. Dad was gazing down valley with a flummoxed expression. "Is that Martin Andreson?" he inquired, pointing at a man in a coat, picking his way toward us through the rocks. Roxana said, "Who?" "Martin Andreson," Dad replied. "Government man. Is that him, kids? I can't quite tell." The fellow was wearing a knee-length coat, belted at the waist, and he was stepping carefully alongside the fire vane. He hadn't any picnic basket, and his hands were pocketed. Then out came one hand, and he waved at us like some old friend. "It's him," I said. Dad sighed. "What's he want? Who is he?" Roxana wondered. Dad didn't answer. Where was he supposed to start? Jeremiah? Well, you'll see. "Hello," said Martin Anderson, walking up. "Hello, Jeremiah. Reuben. Say, where's your girl?" Dad looked around. Swede had disappeared as briskly as that juniper tree. "Exploring, I guess. You're in time for supper, Mr. Anderson." "Thank you. I ate." The putrid Fed picked a boulder and sat himself down. He popped loose a cigarette and lit it from the ground fire, then took a big puff and winked at me through the smoke. He always acted like he was your favorite uncle visiting from India. Boy, it was aggravating. "Roxana, this is Martin Andreson," Dad said. "Martin, Roxana." "My pleasure, Mrs. Colley." It was quite a moment while Anderson smoked and looked around. You couldn't help but notice he was kind of a handsome jerk, sitting there in the glow. He looked extremely tickled also. I figured we were in serious trouble on account of staying hid so long. "Well?" Dad inquired. "I'm pleased," Anderson replied, "to have run across you again. Do you know, I had some car trouble back in Linton." "Looks like you're fixed up now." "I'll be honest, Mr. Land, we are getting close to Davy, and the closer we get, the more dangerous for him. I'm not threatening anyone, it's just the truth." "Go ahead." "I'm asking for your help. I understand your reluctance." "I can't help you. If you're close, as you say, you already know more than I do," Dad replied, adding after a moment, "Just for the sake of discussion, how close do you suppose you are?" "He's in the Badlands," Anderson said. "You appreciate the Badlands, are fair-sized." Anderson smoked a little, appeared to decide on forthrightness. "A rancher not far from here keeps a few pigs in his barn. Last week the daughter went out to do chores, and her favorite of these pigs was missing. Yes, her favorite. Pen closed, barn door shut. Well, these mysteries happen sometimes. Pigs are smart, I understand, so they didn't call the sheriff till they lost a second pig the same way, vanished from a shut pen. Dad said, "Wait a minute, you think it's Davy taking these animals, that he's here?" "Not far from here." "Did somebody see him?" Andreessen said, "I expect he'd be taking them for food, don't you?" "Did they see him?" Andreessen seemed to feel he had offered adequate detail. "Yes, almost certainly." He leaned over, dropped his cigarette into the fire, then peered down after it. "What we'd like, Mr. Land, is for you to come with us, just for a day or two. Drive around a little." "Drive around," Dad said. "We'd appreciate it." Through all this, Roxana had held silent. Of course, I didn't know how much Dad had told her regarding Davy. Nothing in our hearing. Clearly, he hadn't breathed a word about old Putrid here, yet watching Roxana, you'd have guessed she not only knew my brother, but had raised him herself and tutored him in evading the law. Her face was shut and latched against Andreessen, which I suppose isn't surprising, given how her great-uncle felt about Pinkertons. "Drive around," Dad mused. "Mr. Andreessen, do you still believe I can somehow lead you to my son?" "Not by natural means," answered Andreessen. "Do you suspect the other kind are at my disposal?" Andreessen said, "The work I am in sometimes overlaps into other domains. You may be able to help us. I would say calibrate our search." Dad stiffened. "I'm no diviner. Don't talk to me about it." "No offense intended," Andreessen said, "but hear me out." "Will you hear me out?" Dad didn't answer. 2 years ago, there was a kidnapping, a little girl in Michigan. The kidnapper put her in a rented cabin and drove away to find a phone booth, only he went off an icy curve and smacked a barn, and that was it for him. Want to guess how we found the little girl? Just finish, Mr. Andreessen. "I don't blame you. Actually, I thought my supervisor was off his nut. He'd been talking to the family and their friends. There was a sister about 11. He came to me. This is Ray Levy, my supervisor. He thought the sister could locate the little girl." "You don't know what you're associating with," Dad said. "Well, that's the truth, and I don't pretend to. But the sister went out with us. We drove in rough circles, starting from their home. Listen, it's not exactly procedure, and it doesn't make any popular sort of sense." To his credit, Andreessen appeared less than cozy with this story he was telling. He lit another cigarette and looked at it while he talked. "At some point, she began telling us where to turn. It upset her. She cried and so forth. And we made some wrong turns, I'll not lie to you. We all knew the ending, though, same as you do. We found her just before dark," he said. "The cabin was freezing. She wouldn't have made it till morning." The whole thing made my insides sick. Don't get me wrong. I was glad the little girl was all right. Yet it gave me a seasick clutch behind the ribs, as if my heart were bobbing loose. I wanted to bolt from there, for I found I didn't hate Andreessen anymore. I feared him, not knowing why, and can testify to you that this was worse. "I can't do what you're asking, Mr. Andreessen," Dad said. "You're a man of faith. Everyone says it." "It isn't faith you're speaking of. It's something else. Foolishness or spookism." "There's a man back in roofing who believes you have access to something large," Andreessen said. "Some unusual authority," he clarified. "For goodness sake, be quiet," Dad said. "Your boss, Mr. Holgren, the fellow who fired you." Dad stood up. "I thank you," he said, "for keeping us informed. Should anything develop, we've taken rooms with Mrs. Colley. You may reach us there." At which Andreessen stood up also, handing Dad a card with a phone number, stressing his sincerity and hoping Dad would reconsider. We watched him walk back down the valley, vanishing amid firelit boulders. Now, no doubt you're asking some of the same questions I asked Swede later, back at Roxana's, such as, why hadn't Andreessen arrested us on the spot, complicit fugitives that he figured us to be? "I don't know," she answered. "We were getting our pajamas on, the various thrills of the evening still working through our veins. And why, if he was so confident about closing the net on Davy, was our Putrid willing to subscribe even to spookism to nail him down?" "Don't know," Swede said. "What is spookism anyhow?" I complained. The word conjured a scary version of faith in which a person believed mostly in malicious unseen fellows who might creep up behind you and breathe on your neck hairs. But Swede paid no mind. She was wholly taken with the ambrosial thought of staying on at Roxana's and the turns of the past few hours. From no hint of Davy to an eyewitness sighting, from another frozen road trip to a warm reprieve in a home that felt more like the term than roofing ever had. I had to agree with her. It went to show that anyone could deliver good news, including a person like Martin Andreessen, even if he wasn't doing so purposefully, and even if he was the king of pukes in most respects.